The baker's boy, who is 12 and hates his life. The liveryman, who has been up since 4:30 because the horses do not care what hour it is. And a woman in a gray shawl, crossing the street with a covered basket. The first three had a reason to be awake. Everybody in that town could have told you what it was. Nobody could have told you the fourth. She did it every single morning for 7 years. In snow, in mud, in the black of January. And she never once explained it to a living soul, because explaining it would have meant explaining everything else. There was a sentence she had ready for the day somebody finally got close enough to need it. 7 words. She'd had them polished for years. You don't know what I've done. It was meant to end the conversation. It was meant to end whatever conversation was leading toward, cleanly and permanently, so that nobody would have to hear the rest. She finally said it in the spring of 1889, to a liveryman standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. And Gideon Locke, who had watched her cross that street at 5 o'clock every morning for 7 years and had never once asked her why, did not do what she expected. He answered her. Junction, Bend, Colorado, was a stage stop with ambitions. Hester Vaughn had come there in the autumn of 1882, alone, with one trunk and a sewing machine, and had taken 2 rooms behind a mercantile and put out a shingle. She was better than good and cheap and reliable, and within a year half the women in that county had something of hers in the wardrobe. She was pleasant. She was helpful in a sickness. She was in church most Sundays. And in 7 years, not one person in Junction, Bend, could have told you where she came from, whether she'd been married or whether she had a living soul in the world. They noticed. They decided it was ladylike reticence, and let it be. It was not reticence. She had a rule about it, and she kept the rule the way other people keep religion. She would be kind to anybody. She would sit up with a sick child and mend a burial dress for nothing and take a covered dish to a funeral like everybody else. But she would not be known. Friendships were allowed to reach a certain warmth, and then she stepped back from them, gently and unmistakably, and people learned. Twice in 7 years, a man had made his intentions plain to her. Both times she had said the same thing, in a voice with a door in it. You don't know me. Both times they had gone away, and both times she had gone home and been sick with the relief of it. Gideon Locke ran the livery at the east end of the street. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, big and unhurried, and he was up at 4:30 every morning of his life, because the eastbound stage went out at 6 and horses take time, which meant that Gideon Locke, standing in a lantern-lit barn doorway with a harness over his shoulder, had watched a woman in a gray shawl cross that street at 5 o'clock in the morning approximately 2,500 times. He'd seen her do it in a blizzard. He'd seen her do it the morning after she'd sat up all night with the Pedersen's baby. He knew which way she went and about how long she was gone. He had never once followed her, and never once asked her, and never once mentioned it to another human being. There was a reason for that, and the reason was a man named Roy Locke. Gideon's father had been the town drunk of a place 200 miles east, and a thief when he was drunk enough. And Gideon had grown up as that Locke boy, watched in stores, blamed by default, looked at. He'd left at 17 and built a life out of horses in a town where nobody knew the name. So when a woman crossed the street in the dark every morning with a basket and plainly did not want to be asked about it, Gideon Locke did the one thing his childhood had taught him properly. He minded his own business. For 7 years. Here is what she was doing. 3 streets over and one back, in a small house with sagging porch, lived a widow named Elspeth Corliss, and, until they grew and scattered, her 4 children. Elspeth's husband Samuel had been a freight clerk. He had been killed at his own counter in the spring of 1878 in a robbery, and his widow had come west afterward to her brother, and had raised 4 children on washing and a garden. And for 7 years on the Corliss back step, things had appeared: a crock of milk, a dozen eggs, a sack of flour, firewood, split, stacked, in February. Once, when the eldest girl was married, a bolt of good cloth with no note on it, always before dawn. Never any note, never one seen. Elspeth Corliss believed it was a church. The church believed it was Elspeth's brother, her brother, who had nothing, assumed it was a church. Gideon began to court her in March of 1889, slowly and without any fuss. He fixed the hinge on her back gate, without being asked. He started buying his shirts made rather than ready, which the whole street found hilarious, and nobody said so. He walked her home from the Grange supper in April and did not touch her arm. Hester Vaughn, 32 and 7 years careful, felt the ground start to go out from under her. Because she liked him. That was the trouble. She had never once been in danger before, and she knew exactly how it ended. She refused him twice that spring, gently, with no reason given. He did not go away. The third time, he came to her door in the evening with his hat in his hands and asked her plainly to marry him, and said he'd like a real answer this time, and that if it was no, he'd take it and never trouble her again. And Hester Vaughn, who had spent 7 years building a wall out of exactly one sentence, went and got it, Mr. Locke. Her voice was steady, which she was proud of later. You don't know what I've done. She waited for what always came next. The flinch, the polite retreat, the man deciding he'd rather not know. Gideon Locke turned his hat around once in his hands. Then he said, No, ma'am, but I know what you do every morning at 5. She could not speak. 7 years, he said. Gray shawl. Basket. Out the back of the mercantile. Across the street, up past the church, and gone about 20 minutes. He looked at the floor of her porch, not at her, which was a kindness. I've never followed you, and I never will. I don't know where you go, and it's not mine to know. But whatever it is, ma'am, you've done it 2,000 mornings in the dark with nobody watching and no credit for it, and whether that'd keep a doctor home. He looked up. Now, you can tell me whatever it is you've done, and I'll hear it. But I've had 7 years of evidence about who you are, and I'd not throw that over for one bad year, whatever was in it. He gave her a week to answer, because she asked for one. She spent 4 days of that week deciding to leave Junction Bend. It was a sensible thing. She'd done it before. Packed a life into a trunk in a night and taken the morning stage, and she got as far as pricing a ticket to Salt Lake and writing a note she never left, because she could not work out how to explain, in a note, that if she left, the basket stopped. 7 years of mornings, and nobody in that house had the first idea where any of it came from. If she went, they'd simply stop, and Elspeth Corliss would decide that God had gotten tired, or the church had, and would never know differently. She was still standing in her rooms with the trunk half-packed on the 5th day, when the eastbound stage came in, and a young man got off it. His name was Tom Corliss, and he was 23 years old. He had been 7 when a man walked into his father's freight office, and his father did not come home, and he had spent the 11 years since collecting the facts the way some men collect debts. There had been 3 of them. A man named Doyle, hanged in 1879. A man named Kessick, killed resisting arrest. And Doyle's wife, 19 years old, who had driven the wagon and said nothing, and who had gone to the territorial prison for 4 years and walked out of it in 1882 and vanished. Annie Doyle. Tom Corliss had spent 2 years and most of his savings finding out where Annie Doyle went. He got off the stage at 4 in the afternoon and started asking polite questions at the hotel. It should be said plainly what she did, because the story is worth nothing if it's soft about it. In 1878, Annie Doyle was 19 and had been married 2 years to a charming, frightening man who had turned out to be a thief. She was afraid of him in a specific way that does not excuse a person and does explain them. On the 9th of April, he told her to drive the wagon and wait at the end of the alley. She drove the wagon. She waited at the end of the alley. She did not go for help, and she did not warn anybody, and a freight clerk named Samuel Corliss, 41 years old for children, was shot dead behind his own counter over $90. She never pulled a trigger. It has never once, in 11 years, seemed to her like much of distinction. She served 4 years. Her husband was hanged. And when she came out at 23 with nothing, she found out where the Corliss family had gone, and she followed them, and she has been getting up at 5 o'clock ever since. He found her outside the mercantile at midday, in front of 6 people. Annie Doyle, said Tom Corliss. It was the first time in 11 years anyone had said that name out loud to her face, and the street heard it, and everything stopped. She could have denied it. She'd had 7 years to prepare a denial, and it was a good one. Hester Vaughn set down the parcel she was carrying and stood very straight and said, "Yes." Then she said, in front of the mercantile, in the middle of a Tuesday, to a young man she had never met and had thought about every day of his life, "I drove the wagon. I was 19. I was frightened of my husband, and that is a reason and not an excuse. Your father was killed and I helped it happen, and I served 4 years, which was not enough, and there is nothing I can say to you that is worth your time." She did not cry, and she did not ask him for anything. Tom Corliss had rehearsed 11 years of things to say and could not get any of them out. What came out instead was shaking and ugly and entirely fair. "You don't get to be a decent woman here." His voice cracked on it. "Not on my father. You don't get to be Miss Vaughn the seamstress and sit in a church and have people say how kind you are. Not on him." And a voice from up the street said, "Tom?" Elspeth Corliss had come out of the post office with a mail in her hand, and she had heard, from about the word Doyle, every single thing that had been said. She stood in the road looking at a woman she had known for 7 years. Then she said to her son and to the 6 people watching, "Not in the street. Both of you. My house." They sat in that kitchen for a long time before anybody said anything worth writing down. Tom said the fact again. Hester agreed with all of them and defended none of them. Elspeth Corliss listened with her hands flat on the table, like a woman holding something down. And then she said the thing nobody in the room expected. 7 years ago, something started appearing on my back step. She got up and took a household book down off the shelf, a plain accounts ledger, the kind a careful poor woman keeps, and opened it in front of them. Milk, eggs, flour, firewood. I wrote it down. I wrote all of it down because I'm not a fool in a thing that regular has a source, and I spent 7 years unable to name it. She turned the book around. I asked the church. The church didn't know. I asked my brother. She looked at Hester Vaughn. "How long have you been leaving things at my door?" The kitchen was very quiet. 7 years, said Hester, since the October I came. Every morning? Yes. Through the winters? Yes. Elspeth Corliss sat back in her chair. And Tom, 23 years old, who had spent 2 years and most of his savings tracking a woman across 3 territories, so he could stand in front of her and say something that mattered, put his head down on his mother's kitchen table and wept like the 7-year-old boy he had been in 1878, because he had done the arithmetic. "I came here to look at the woman who did it," he said when he could. He was still bent over the table. "Turns out I've been eating her bread my whole life." There was no absolution in that kitchen. It should be said, because the easy version of this story is a lie. Elspeth Corliss did not forgive her that afternoon. She said so. What she said was, "I don't know what I've got for you. I'm not going to pretend to. My husband is dead and you were there, and no amount of flour makes that different." Then she closed the household book. "But you fed my children for 7 years and never once let me thank you, and I'll not have that go on. It stops being a secret today. If you're going to do a thing for me, you'll do it to my face like a neighbor, and I'll say, 'Thank you,' and you'll have to bear being thanked." Which was, Hester Vaughn understood later, the hardest and most generous sentence anybody ever said to her. Tom left on the Thursday stage. He did not say he forgave her. He shook her hand at the stage office, badly, and got on, and that was all, and that was always a great deal more than she had any right to. Junction Ben took it about how you'd expect. Some people never spoke to her again. 2 families took their sewing elsewhere. There were opinions in that town for years, and some of them were vicious, and she bore all of it without once arguing, because she had decided long ago that she had no standing to argue. Enough of them stayed, and Gideon Locke, who had been given a week and had spent it feeding horses and saying nothing to anybody, came to her door on the Friday with his hat in his hands, exactly as before. She started to tell him he'd want to withdraw his question. He said he'd heard the whole of it from 4 separate people, most of them wrong, and would prefer to hear from her. And then, after she told it, he said the only thing he had ever intended to say, "That's the worst year of your life." I asked about the other 31. They were married in the September, quietly, with the Corliss family invited and Elspeth attending, which cost her something and which she did anyway. Tom Corliss did not come to the wedding. He wrote, 2 years later, when his first child was born, a short letter, not warm, but a letter addressed to Mrs. Locke. She kept in the household book Elspeth had given her, and read it perhaps 100 times. Some things don't finish. That one never entirely did, but it moved. She never stopped going at 5 o'clock. It's only that it wasn't a secret anymore, and that she went in at the door instead of leaving things on the step, and that Elspeth Corliss would generally have the coffee on. And on the morning, it started to be 2 people crossing that street in the dark, a woman with a basket and a big, unhurried man carrying the heavy end of whatever it was. The stage driver noticed, and the baker's boy noticed, and neither of them thought much about it, because by then it was simply a thing that happened in that town at 5 in the morning. Twice in her life, she had told a man, "You don't know me," and meant it as a locked door. The last person to say those words to her was Elspeth Corliss. 4 years later, in the kitchen, when Hester tried to apologize for the 200th time about something that could not be apologized for, the old woman put her hand flat on the table. "Hester," she said, "stop. You don't know me either, or you know I made up my mind about you a long while back." 5 o'clock. Same street. Somebody had been watching the whole time.